Hey everyone! Welcome to Update X24H, your go-to channel for the latest news, hottest dramas, breaking stories, and all the buzz from the world of entertainment. We're here to keep you updated, entertained, and always in the loop. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing family, because here at Update X24H, we bring you the news that matters, the drama you love, and the stories you can't miss. Thanks for being part of our community. Let's stay connected, stay updated, and keep the good vibes rolling. There are moments when silence speaks louder than words. 2 days after the 798 Art Museum quietly locked its doors, it reopened, not with an apology but with an image. An image that looked so hauntingly familiar. Many swore they saw him, Menglong. What was meant to be art suddenly became a ghostly echo. And once again the world trembled, asking, why would they do this? When the museum doors opened again, it wasn't just another exhibition. It was the resurrection of a wound that had barely begun to heal. The photograph hung beneath sterile lights, yet it radiated something human, something painfully familiar. The contours of the face, the distant gaze, the fragile calm. It was as though Menglong had been pulled back from memory itself, frozen between the living and the dead. People stopped breathing for a moment, unsure whether they were looking at art or at the shadow of a man who had once lived, laughed, and suffered. What followed was not admiration but outrage, disbelief, and a deep sense of violation. Online, millions began to speak at once. Comment sections turned into vigils, and hashtags became collective cries for dignity. The resemblance was too precise, too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. Every detail whispered of intention, and the silence of the museum only made it worse. To remain quiet in the face of such provocation felt cruel, almost inhuman. People did not see a piece of art, they saw a taunt, a ghost paraded for attention. And in that recognition something broke inside them. Across continents, fans lit candles in their rooms, replayed old interviews, and shared clips where you smiled shyly at the camera. They remembered his voice, his gentleness, the way he always seemed to hold back as if protecting a secret world within himself. For them this image was not nostalgia, it was desecration. It reopened the ache of losing someone who represented purity in an industry clouded by corruption and manipulation. In the quiet spaces between anger and grief, the discussion deepened. What is the line between art and exploitation? Between homage and cruelty? The museum's decision was not seen as creative expression but as arrogance. An act of dominance over memory itself. It made people realize that remembrance is sacred, that once you turn pain into spectacle, you strip it of meaning. And so the world did not look away. They mourned anew not because of death, but because of how easily the dead can be misused by the living. In their outrage they gave Menglong something rare. Not pity, but the dignity of being remembered for who he was, not what others made of him. Then when the world thought the storm had passed, a forgotten echo rose from the past. A post written by Menglong himself, buried deep in 2018, now unearthed like a time capsule of pain. The words were simple, almost harmless on the surface, yet loaded with the quiet sorrow of a man who saw too much and trusted too deeply. Some friendships, he wrote, are painted with borrowed colors. They fade when the truth appears. At the time no one noticed. But now with the museum's haunting image circulating online, those words struck like lightning. It felt as though you had spoken across time, warning of betrayal, of masks worn by those closest to him. His message, once overlooked, had become a mirror reflecting the shadow that followed him until his final day. People began to connect the dots, or at least tried to. The friend with many masks became the center of speculation, theories, and whispered names. But behind the rumors lay something deeper. A realization that perhaps Menglong had sensed his own undoing. His artistry, his silence, his gentle demeanor, all carried an undertone of restraint, as though he knew the world could turn against him at any moment. That haunting awareness now gave every line he wrote, every frame he appeared in, a new weight. Each smile looked lonelier, each performance more fragile, and each pause between his words felt like a cry for help that nobody had heard. The resurfacing of the post didn't just reignite the public's grief. It transformed it. Fans were no longer mourning a death. They were grieving the truth that he had tried, and failed, to communicate while alive. The internet became a living monument to that missed conversation. People wrote letters to him, lit candles beneath his old photos, and shared fragments of his interviews, trying to decipher hidden meanings in his tone, his eyes, his hesitations. Every moment of kindness he had ever shown now seemed heavier, like a man offering love to a world that would not give it back. Some began to question whether the photograph at the 798 museum was an accident at all. Could someone have known about that old post? Was it an intentional provocation, a cruel nod to his most private words? Others dismissed it as coincidence, but the damage was already done. The emotional lines had been drawn. The living felt complicit in his silence. What had started as a scandal turned into a collective confession of guilt. People saw not just Menglong's tragedy, but their own capacity for forgetting. And amid the chaos, a strange calm began to spread. For the first time, his voice, the quiet, trembling one beneath the glamour, was finally heard. The world began to understand that the true horror wasn't his death, but how easily it had been ignored until now. In rediscovering his pain, people rediscovered their own humanity. The outrage softened into reverence, and what began as a mystery became a prayer, a silent vow that no truth this fragile should ever be buried again. Maybe immortality does not come from fame or fortune, but from the echo one leaves behind in the hearts of those who refuse to forget. In the weeks following the uproar, the world seemed quieter yet heavier. The frenzy of accusations gave way to a more profound silence, the kind that comes when people finally begin to understand. Menglong's story no longer felt like gossip or tragedy. It had transformed into something far deeper, something that forced everyone to confront the uncomfortable truth about how easily humanity can look away from pain until it becomes too late. What happened with the 798 museum was no longer just a scandal, it was a mirror reflecting the cost of our collective indifference. As people revisited his films, interviews, and performances, they began to see him differently. The charm, the gentleness, the shy smiles that once seemed effortless now carried a quiet melancholy, like someone trying to hold the world together while falling apart inside. Every line he delivered on screen, every fleeting expression, seemed to whisper what words could never say. That behind every beautiful performance lies a fragile soul trying to stay whole. In this way, his art outlived the noise that once surrounded him. It spoke not of glamour but of endurance, not of success but of survival. The 798 museum, perhaps unintentionally, reminded the world that art without compassion becomes cruelty. When beauty is built upon another's suffering, it loses its humanity. What people saw in that haunting image wasn't just resemblance, it was exploitation disguised as tribute. Yet paradoxically, that same act of arrogance rekindled something sacred. It brought people together, across nations and languages, to remember a man who had become more than his death. They began to speak about ethics in art, about the dignity of the departed, about the fine line between remembrance and appropriation. In that dialogue, his legacy found new life. Slowly, the outrage softened into reverence. Grief became gratitude. People realized that to truly honor someone is not to repeat their pain, but to protect others from it. In every post, every candle, every whispered thank you, there was an unspoken promise, to listen more carefully, to care more deeply, to see the human behind the performance. Menglong's story stopped being a tragedy told in headlines. It became a parable about empathy, memory, and the courage to feel. Perhaps that is what remains when everything else fades. The truth that love, once given, never disappears. It lingers in the quiet spaces, in the eyes of strangers who still remember. And maybe that is how he lives on. Not as a star on a screen or a name in a headline, but as a reminder that kindness is the only legacy that time cannot erase. The lights of the museum will dim again, but his story will continue to glow softly in the hearts of those who finally learn to listen. If this story touched you, share it. Not for the drama but for the memory. Let us keep his light alive by remembering the humanity behind the headlines. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us as we uncover more stories the world tried to silence. Because truth, no matter how faint, always finds a way to return.